Hi, everyone. Michael Cavacini here, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Peter Atkins. Peter is a writer, and this year marks the 30th anniversary of Hellraiser 3, which he had a lot to do with. So we'll be getting into that today, as well as a host of other topics. So, Peter, thank you for joining me. Appreciate you being here.
Oh, no, thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for the invite, and I'm delighted to be here.
Excellent. So let's start at the beginning. So tell me about the dog company and that experience. What was that like?
Sure. Should I give some historical
Yes,
background
for
rather
those
than
who
just
don't know
how?
what the dog company is, feel free to
Yes,
explain.
I assume your audience will have no idea, and nor should they. Dog Company wasn't originally called Dog Company, but it's the name by which it's now best known. It was a theatre company that was formed originally in 1974, because that's how old I am, folks. It was formed in 1974 by, among other people, but names your viewers might recognize: Clive Barker and Doug Bradley and me. And for most of its life, the other three main members were Phil Rimmer, Julie Blake, and Lynn Darnell. Later, Ollie Parker, who went on to be a marvelous director himself, joined the company, as did several other people, both before and after the 6 or 7 years I spent with them. We were school kids, essentially, when we started it. I think I was literally just finishing high school. Clive, who's 3 years older than me, had just finished university. And as I say, we went through various names. But we eventually stuck with the Dog Company for at least half a decade. And it was an avant-garde, some might say pretentious and strange theatre company. And like most avant-garde, pretentious and strange theatre companies, we very often outnumbered our audience. So fortunately, we were young and healthy, and it was in the socialist decade of the 70s in Britain, so we could all get a little state support. But we would rehearse these pieces for months on end, and then perform them maybe twice, maybe 3 times, to audiences of 7, 14, if we were lucky, 21. But it was, I guess I should explain again for people who don't swim in my tiny pond. Clive Barker, I'm sure, doesn't need an introduction. He's a very, very well-known, world-famous author. And Doug, our three-way connection years after the Dog Company was the Hellraiser film series, which Clive created. I wrote 3 of the movies, and Doug plays what I'm reliably informed is now the iconic horror figure of Pinhead. Not his real name, it'd be very insulted if you called him that, but it's what he's known by on the call sheet. The man with the nails in his face from the Hellraiser movie posters. And this all happened in the northern English town of Liverpool. We're all from Liverpool, which a mere 12 years before us had become famous for producing the Beatles, and is a lot less famous for producing us. But it was the same Merseyside talent pool that gave birth to the Dog Company, and as a consequence, a decade or so later, gave birth to the Hellraiser movies.
That's great. And so you've known Clive obviously for a long time now.
Mm-hmm.
When you think of Clive, what are your fondest memories? Just the things that you think of first that just make you smile and laugh.
Oh, I mean, I should have done my homework, because it's hard to summon up. First of all, Clive. It's funny when you talk about friends in the past, you're tempted to use the past tense, and of course, when you get to our age, it's dangerous to use the past tense, because people. So let me assure your viewers, Clive Barker is alive and well, and living about 4.5 miles from where I'm living now. So when I say he was, I don't mean in any way that he has ceased to be. But Clive was astonishingly good company, which I think is the simplest way to say it. I mean, as was Doug, as was everybody else in Dog Company. We certainly all entertained each other and were delighted by each other. But I know you're specifically interested in Clive, and he was, I guess, what you would expect him to be. He was smart, funny, opinionated, generous with his time, generous to his friends, a smart ass, you know, a lot of sarcastic humor, but also a lot of, I think in some ways you don't realize it so much when you're young, but one of the things I realize in retrospect that I value most in friendships, particularly lifelong friendships, is enthusiasm and curiosity. I mean, you got to be funny and clever as well, or I won't like you that much. But let's assume funny and clever is a given. Enthusiasm and curiosity are really, I think, the things that keep minds alive. And when you're talking about more than one mind in common, therefore keep friendships alive. You know, Clive was never somebody to dwell on, remember when this happened. Clive was always interested in what's next, what's new. I like to think I am too. I think Doug was. I think most interesting people are, you know, even when you get old, you're interested not so much in, we used to walk miles through the snow to get to school. I mean, that's for stupid and terrible people. You want to know what's up, you know, what's coming next. Not necessarily in your own life. I mean, obviously, hopefully you're interested in that too, but to keep an open and engaged mind about the arts, whether it's literature, movies, theater, ballet, painting, whatever. It's like, what's going on? What's coming up? Because I'm sidestepping the Clive question specific. Let me try and think about, I'll tell you a weird anecdote, which he won't mind me telling because he himself has done on occasion, but it might surprise some Clive Barker fans to hear this. He and I, and all members of the Dog Company, were of course inveterate moviegoers. This is like, we're that old, this is like pre-VHS days. You had to go to the movies to see movies, and we went a lot. And Clive Barker, you know, the king of horror, the Prince of Pain. We went to see Chinatown in whenever Chinatown was released, 75, 76, maybe even 74. And as I recall, I think it was Clive, it was me, it was Julie Blake from, it might just have been the three of us. Anyway, at one point, Roman Polanski, playing a little tough guy, surprises the Jack Nicholson character by slicing his nose. Tiny amount of blood flows, but it's very nasty. It's a nasty moment. Polanski is, this is not verbatim, obviously. The character says something like, you're very nosy. You know what happens to nosy people? They lose their noses. The knife appears and just sort of hacks it. Anyway, so I'm sitting there watching, oh, it's good stuff. At which point I realized Clive has fallen to his knees and is crawling up the aisle to get out because he was about to faint at the sight of the blood in the scene in Chinatown. So I just want all you Hellraiser fans out there to remember, Clive Barker nearly passed out when he was watching Chinatown. And as I say, I wouldn't tell that story if he had not told it himself on occasion, because I wouldn't want to damage his reputation as Mr. Blood.
That's great. And you were talking about the arts. So Clive is obviously an exceptional writer, but you know, you're a writer as well. So I'm just curious, because I find that creative people love to connect with other creative people. I mean, that's why we're talking today. I respect your talent, and I wanted to kind of have that connection. So when you think of Clive as a writer, you know, what are your thoughts on his style, his work, maybe how it's evolved over time? Just, you know, writer to writer, what are your thoughts on Clive when it comes to that talent?
Wow. Okay. I really should have prepared for the interview. My response to his work was visceral rather than analytic at the time. And, you know, I don't know whether I've ever sat back consciously and tried to analyze the thing, but but let me attempt for you. I would say clearly, I mean, particularly in the field he chose, or at least initially chose, which was that branch of popular fiction known as horror. I think one of the things that made, for example, Stephen King sit up and take notice at this brash newcomer was, how would I put it, the unblinking gaze, the unafraid to look and describe what, I mean, obviously his mental eye, not his real eye, but to describe what his imagination's eye was seeing, and put your face firmly in it, to not shy away, to not suggest. People have said this before about his work, that it's that in some ways it was a precursor of the splatterpunk movement, sort of extreme horror, the in-your-face gore. And of course, to some extent, it was and is. But I never like people to say that without acknowledging that he was also quite good at the suggestive, the ambiguous, the mysterious, the evocative. And again, widening out from him to, I think, all good writers of supernatural horror, that has to be in there. I mean, let's say both. He was probably the first modern horror writer to really, I think, get or reestablish, not reestablish, redefine what that connective juncture of medical photography literature, i.e., you know, all the blood, all the scars, all the wounds, and metaphysical speculation mixed into one handy package. And that's, you know, that's nothing to blink at. That was quite an achievement. And I think that is, you know, certainly why people like Ramsey Campbell and Stephen King, who were established as the kings of the field, were very quick and very kind to welcome him as a startling new voice in the field. That's really about, I guess, in a way, the content, specifically as it relates to the genre. But there are other questions in a writer's style. And I think, I mean, I would leave it to the academics to pin this down precisely. But certainly one of the things that I enjoyed then and would still enjoy now would be, there's a kind of, Clive skirts very well in the early books, especially, the line between the omniscient narrator, which was the dominant voice of the 19th century, the godlike figure who sees all and describes all, and what writers call third-person subjective, which is you're not technically telling a first-person story, but you're in the character's head so much that it's the third-person equivalent of a first-person story. And Clive's very good at third-person subjective, which is the dominant form of popular fiction for the second half of the 20th century, and so far most of this one. But he's got enough old school in him that there's still a little bit of that Dickensian omniscient narrator, the person who sees all, describes all. So I think that's probably that blend of the old and the new, that blend of flavors is, it's not unique to Clive, but it's a specific strength, I would say, of certainly the early books.
Yeah, agreed. So Clive, as most people know, isn't just a writer. He also has directed and produced, many iconic films. What are your thoughts on his ability to direct and produce?
Well, he's proved that he can. I am obviously prejudiced because I took over the series and wrote the subsequent Hellraiser movies. So I'm going to say that of the three movies Clive directed, it's always annoying to an artist when somebody picks their first one. So I apologize to my old friend in advance. Yeah, because, you know, it's always that the asshole that, yeah, the first album's good. Everything after that sucks. That first #1 hit, that was great. Then, but I think, excuse me, sorry, of the three directorial things he did, you've got Hellraiser, you've got Nightbreed, you've got Load of Illusions. And I think Hellraiser, in some ways, possibly because of the limitations of its budget compared to the other two, there's a kind of, well, hardly an Aristotelian unity to it. It does take more than one day and take place in more than one place. But if I use the word integrity, I'm not talking about any sort of moral position here. I mean, the way something knits together and is uniquely and consistently itself. In that sense, I think Hellraiser is a tighter movie of more structural and thematic not thematic. I think you get what I'm saying, that it is more of itself, more completely from beginning to end of the three movies. But obviously, all three of them have tremendous strengths. But yeah, and as I say, I'm probably prejudiced, biased to go with Hellraiser. And I think, you know, very often people are surprised when they look back at, because he made such a splash with Hellraiser, and then with the sequels, which he didn't write or direct, but was, you know, executive producer on certainly a couple of them. Then he had a falling out with film companies and wasn't necessarily involved with some others. But so people are often surprised when they look at it and they, oh, he only directed 3 movies, because I think because Hellraiser was such a big hit, I think some people might think of him as a film director, almost as much as they might think of him as a writer. And far be it from me to suggest that the number of movies made has any relation to the quality of the work or the standing of the filmmaker. I'm trying to think, let me make an analogy by jumping back to literature for a moment. You know, until that unfortunate late release, way late in her life, Harper Lee is a great example of somebody who is venerated as an author, but she wrote 1 book. So quantity has nothing to do with quality. Raymond Chandler only wrote 7 novels. But, you know, most of us who are fond of good writing would argue that his 7 are worth 200 by people who should be nameless. So, so when I say Clive only directed 3 movies, I'm talking strictly quantitatively, not qualitatively. But he's certainly, you know, but there are more books than there are films he's directed, for example. And of course, there are a lot more paintings. And, you know, again, I can't in any way speak for Clive. But you know, I know as an observer, let's say, that an awful lot of his time now, certainly for the last 10 years, has been spent back on the visual arts, which strangely is a circle closing for me. When I first met Clive, he wanted to do theatre. He had vague sense that he might write prose fiction, but it wasn't a big thing. I think I'm right in saying that he thought of himself at the time primarily as a visual artist, both with pen and ink and with brush and canvas. So, and that has been a constant throughout his life, as I'm sure you know. So the fact that he's now, again, as I'm sure you and some of your viewers will know, it was really writing the Abarat books that triggered this, you know, massive proliferation in large canvases again later in his life. So, and I think again, just in terms of quantity, the quality is present in whatever medium we're talking about. But in terms of quantity, it's the visual arts that it's the paintings and the drawings that massively outnumber everything else he's done in writing and film and indeed theatre. I've got away from your question. I'm sorry.
No, that was great. I mean, I really appreciate that. And yeah, he's multidimensional. And
Sure.
you mentioned Doug Bradley earlier.
Mm-hmm.
He's a spectacular actor, marvelous voice. And just tell me about your thoughts on Doug, any memories or just admiration you have for his talents, just anything you'd like to share about Doug.
Sure. Well, Doug is it's funny, I saw Doug more recently than I've seen Clive. In fact, Doug and I had dinner about a month ago, even though Doug lives in Pittsburgh, and as I say, Clive lives 4.5 miles away. But there's been a lockdown and people haven't seen much of each other. But Doug was in town, came into town for Monsterpalooza, a horror convention. So he and I had dinner. And, as ever, it was always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to see him, as was this time. And he remains a sort of dourly amused fellow that he always was. Let me think about Doug. Yeah, I mean, you're right. He has a marvelous and mellifluous voice, but of course, acting is a lot more than good diction. Is a lot more than a good reading of a fine poem. It's also inhabiting the character, committing to the character. If it's not too crass a word, selling the character to the audience, and. So back in the days of the theatre company, when I was working with Doug, I admired his talent enormously. Just so you know, there were a couple of good actors in Doug company. Doug, certainly. Phil Rimmer, who really gave up a life in the arts, but was a great comic actor. But I would like to say for the record that the two terrible actors in Doug company were Mr. Peter Atkins and Mr. Clive Barker. Not good. But Doug was spectacularly good, and I could see that he was. Later, though, as a writer who was lucky enough to have his words brought to life by Doug, I appreciated it even more, because there you do see that, well, you can write all the piss elegant speeches for Pinhead you want. If you don't have a fine actor delivering those with the kind of precision and clarity and understated emotional heft, it's meaningless. So in a way, once you have written for Doug, your appreciation for his acting ability is very specific. It becomes a kind of, ooh, saved my bacon again kind of thing, which I'm lucky enough, I feel that with many actors who've done my stuff. You think, oh, wow, he really made that crap sing, but Doug is particularly good at that. So, and also he's entirely self-taught, by the way, which used to be more common than it is now. But it's still spectacular to think, he didn't go to school to be an actor. He didn't, for all I know, he's taken some classes late in life. It seems to be a habit for actors out here. So maybe he has done, but he was never afraid of trying. And again, I'll give you a little visual metaphor for it. The first time I met him was literally half an hour, well, maybe an hour after I'd met Clive for the first time. Clive and I had met, bonded very quickly. We were introduced by a mutual friend. And I wandered back with him to this community college where rehearsals were about to begin for something that I was immediately sort of swept into, and they just assumed I was a member of their company by the end of that day. Anyway, we walk in, and my first glimpse of Doug is this. Like I said, it's a college. We were about to work in a room, and there are big, heavy lights hanging from the ceiling. And there's a ladder that is not the sort of ladder you should be using to change heavy overhanging lights, nor should you be attempting to change heavy overhanging lights if you don't know what the fuck you're doing. Nevertheless, balancing precariously at the top of this not quite tall enough ladder and working it out as he went was some guy I'd never met, who when he survived and came down from the ladder, was Doug Bradley. And I think of that often as a sort of metaphor for Doug's approach to art, life, acting in general, which is he had no business being up that ladder. He had no business trying to change that light. He didn't know what the hell he was doing, but he did it anyway. And so I think that's a nice little visual metaphor for Doug and his approach.
That's great. So you talked about, the dog company and how 10 years later, you guys would kind of come together for Hellraiser. So tell me about that. I mean, how did you get involved in this, this cultural phenomenon, if you will, called
Sure.
Hellraiser?
Well, fortunately, I didn't, at the stage that I did become involved, I didn't have the pressure of feeling that I was being invited into a cultural phenomenon, because the first Hellraiser had not been released when I was brought on board to write the second one. So I didn't have the pressure of, this thing's a worldwide phenomenon and Doug's a movie star. That hadn't happened, which was good. There wasn't as much, but I'd seen it. And so I knew that I was being invited in to write the sequel to a really good horror movie. So that was pressure enough. But how it came about, I mean, you can probably guess simply from the other stories I've told. I mean, in art and in the movie business, as in most walks of life, it's, and I don't want to put the bad spin on this, there's that phrase, it's not what you know, it's who you know, which people usually say with a sneer, because it's meant to refer to, oh yeah, the son-in-law got the handy job, got the corner office because he married the boss's daughter. Somebody brings, it's that, but it is, there is a truth behind that, which is neither good nor bad. It simply is, which is for all of us. I was going to say it's easier to, it's not that it's easier, it's just a kind of default. It's a human default to approach people I know I used a music or band metaphor before, but if your lead guitarist quits, I mean, you can put an ad in, this is showing my age, I was going to say put an ad in the paper, like people put ads in papers anymore. You could go on Craigslist or send word out on Twitter. Or if you're a musician in a working band, a lot of other guitarists. So you call the guy because it's just, we already know he's good. We already know he's a decent fellow, he or she. Plenty of great female guitarists out there. And so it was that. It wasn't like a big audition process or anything, because Clive, Doug, and I had worked for a decade together anyway already. And when a guy called Chris Figg, who was Clive's producer, was the guy who produced the first Hellraiser and went on to produce Nightbreed and Hellraiser 2. He and the American financing company New World wanted a sequel, but Chris's plan was that Clive would move on from having written and directed Hellraiser to writing and directing a different project. Now, interestingly, it was going to be a Harry D'Amour movie. Harry D'Amour is the protagonist of Lord of Illusions, which is Clive's third movie. this was not that project. It was a different script that Clive had written. And Chris was trying to set that up. So long story short, so they needed other hands to write and direct the sequel. And, you know, it occurs to Clive to give Chris Figg a couple of, I'd never written a screenplay, but I'd written stories. People have asked me this in interviews before, and it's not like faux naive. I can't remember if I certainly had not been published, but I think I'd sold a couple of stories. They just hadn't appeared yet. So I wasn't completely a newbie, but I was certainly new to the film business. But Chris Figg, being a smart producer, is much more interested in somebody. I'll go back to those words I used earlier. He is interested in enthusiasm and intelligence and energy as much as he is in experience. So I don't even know if he read the stories Clive sent to him. He probably glanced at them and saw, okay, they appear to be in English. And so I just had a meeting with him. And obviously, you know, the fact that I came in with Clive's recommendation carried a lot of weight. But Chris is no dummy and no pushover. So apparently I must have charmed him sufficiently or bamboozled him sufficiently to make him pick up the phone to New World and say, well, we've got the writer for the sequel. And also, before I get too big-headed about it, the pound sterling, which was the UK currency, was remarkably weak against the dollar in that particular 3 months in 1987. So it was so, relatively speaking, inexpensive for New World to hire a British writer than it might have been a year earlier, that they, you know, they didn't do their own due diligence. They, you know, I mean, I'm exaggerating for comic effect, but, you know, essentially Chris Figg called them and said, I found a guy, and they probably looked at the exchange rate of the pound and the dollar and thought, ah, what the hell? Sure, have him write a draft. So I was hired. You know, it was, I didn't realize how lucky I was.
That's great. And so, yeah, this time out, like you said, Clive didn't direct, Tony Randall did. So, because kind of a few questions related to this. One is, what was it like to see your screenplay kind of brought to life on the screen, you know, through Tony? And you know, was there some sort of collaboration there? And then what role did Clive play in that whole process? Like, because you kind of had the three of you guys in a way, kind of bringing this thing to the finish line.
Yeah, I'm not sure what order to take them in. Let's well, first of all, let me say yes. Tony and I Tony and I are friends to this day. He lives a little further away, but LA's big, so the fact, when I grew up, 30 miles was a huge distance. But in Los Angeles, 30 miles is just the next neighborhood over. So Tony and I are still firm friends. And yeah, it was a very, I mean, I had written 3 drafts of the screenplay before Tony was hired. But then the 4th draft that I handed in was very much a result of him and I hanging out. I mean, he didn't do any writing per se on the thing, but we would hang, talk, discuss ideas. So without doubt, the final draft, what we call the production draft, the shooting script, was, you know, certainly had input from him. And what was your other? Oh, and yeah, well, Clive was not a hands-on producer, not because he wouldn't have been more than capable of that, nor because he wouldn't have wanted to, but he had these other projects going on, as I say. So traditionally, you know, the filmmakers of any individual movie, well, the filmmakers are, you know, the 247 people who make the film, but the writer, director, producer tends to be the little trifecta you think of. And so I don't want to take anything away from Chris Figg, is what I'm saying. Chris was the producer of Hellraiser 2. But Clive, well, Clive was Clive, you know, I mean, we're playing in his invention. And the basic storyline, again, not the script. The script was, you know, good and bad, credit or blame. The script is all me. But the what we call the log, the story, the thing you'd boil down to 2 sentences to put in TV Guide, you know what I mean? That was something that Clive and I came up with. It was like being back in Dog Company, actually. We came up with it in one night, sitting in his apartment in London, sharing a bottle, and like cracking the story. And then we showed that to Chris, and Chris said, good. No, hang on, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we didn't pitch anything verbally to Chris, I'm sorry. We came up with it. I went back to live, obviously this was in London. I went back to Liverpool, and on a manual typewriter, I'll have you know, a manual typewriter, I wrote a 10-page, what we call a treatment for the movie, which was basically the story. This would happen, then there's, you know, treatments are horrible to read and they're horrible to write because they are flavorless, simply descriptive sections of this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. And you also have to do what a writer should never do, which is tell, not show, and sell the sizzle, not the steak, you know. But it basically lays out what will happen. So anyway, I went away and I typed up 10 pages and we sent that to Chris. And I can't remember specifically, but Chris will have had, I'm sure, very intelligent notes and observations, and I will have incorporated them in to a second draft of the treatment. And then basically at that point, Chris put me in a hotel, still with a manual typewriter. And I wrote the first draft on that manual typewriter in a very nice small hotel in Hampstead. So Clive was not there through that process, you know, nor would any of us have expected him to be. He certainly came down to Pinewood, where we shot it. But as I say, I never want Chris Figg to be the forgotten man in the Hellraiser story. And he was the producer of the movie. He was there with us every day, in his office for the most part, not on the floor, because again, a good producer knows not to interfere with the director. You don't confuse the crew about who's in charge here. But then certainly again in post-production during the edit of the movie, Clive was, you know, not editing the movie. That was the late great Dickie Marden. Richard Marden edited the movie with Tony, but Clive was more involved in post than during Tony's actual shoot of the movie. So, I mean, I want to be careful that I'm not, by making sure I praise Chris, I don't want to diminish Clive's involvement, but you know, nobody thinks of Clive as not being involved. So I don't think I'm doing any damage there.
No, that's interesting. Good to know. I heard there were some challenges when it came to making the film, specifically budgetary, and that, you know, I've heard the story that when they have the whole, you know, this landscape, I guess, if you will, of with Leviathan, that you guys wanted it to be something grander, but the budget was what the budget was. Is that true? I mean, what was, you know, what are your memories of that? I think
possibly, I mean, the thing is, I'm sure you know this very well, over 35 years, stories both grow themselves in the telling, and they get mixed up with other stories, and then people half remember half of one. because you're not wrong to mention budgetary issues, but it was actually what had happened. There was a memorable, not as memorable as 1929, but there was a stock market crash, I think literally 10 days before we started shooting. And the value of the dollar, it was called Black Tuesday. I mean, like I say, it wasn't the Wall Street crash. It wasn't 1929. And people as young as yourself and other people would probably have to look this up. But, it was news. It was big news. It made the papers. It was called Black Tuesday. And there was a big stock market crash. And of course, the financing of Hellbound was American money. So, yeah, the budget that we thought we had on Monday night, by Tuesday evening, had been cut by a third. Not because anybody said you can't have it. It was just like, oh, shit, the dollar isn't worth what it was. So it's not going to buy the crew time, the set time, the drivers, everything involved with the making of a movie was impacted by the crash of the dollar. However, that was a good, like it's a lot of time, but it wasn't the day before we started shooting. It was 2.5 weeks before. I was new to the industry. I really freaked out. I thought, oh my God, we're screwed. We can't make this film. I've written this thing and they've got, Tony this is roughly, had at least a decade of experience in the film industry. Tony and I are about the same age, but he was actually hired by the legendary Roger Corman. He had worked for Roger Corman's New World Pictures from, I want to say, the late 70s. You'd have to ask him to be precise. But he had worked at New World initially as a visual effects supervisor alongside Jim Cameron and Gail Ann Hurd, interestingly. They all started working for Roger. And then he'd sidestepped into being an executive, development executive, or as we contemptuously refer to them as suits. So Tony had been a suit when he then escaped being a suit by coming back to direct Hellraiser 2. But turns out I was glad he'd been a suit, because when I was flapping and panicking, he said, it's fine. Don't change anything in the script. Keep writing what you're writing. I'll just shoot something in 2 days that we were going to shoot in 3. In other words, he was completely familiar with budgets and how budgets change and how you don't let that freak you out. You just adjust. And so for many years, I would tell that story about, oh, Tony was so great. He just steered that ship and said, and Chris Figg, of course, agreed and made their work. But I realized what that probably meant for my brilliant friends in Image Animation, who are the effects makeup company, is that Tony's decision that this will happen in 2 days instead of 3, or this scene will take place in 2 hours instead of 5, whatever, had no impact on me. That was fine. I continued to write what I was writing. I polished up what we had. It had no real effect on Tony, other than I guess he had to get there on time and work fast. Same deal for Chris. But the lads at Image, what it probably meant was they had to do all their brilliant work twice as fast in half the time. So I'm sure there were a lot of sleepless nights and late nights and even earlier morning starts for those guys. So it took me a long time to realize that. There was like, yeah, it probably wasn't entirely painless. Those lads had to do a lot of fucking work. But it was mainly in those areas because much as I, in other words, going back to the second half of your question, much as I'd like to say, oh no, we had even bigger plans for Hell, that was not true. So it must have been much harder for the guys at Image Animation, work twice as fast. And I'd love to say that, yeah, we intended an even bigger Hell than the one we gave you visually. But the truth is, there wasn't really an impact on that from this budget thing, primarily because the main build of Hell wasn't really a build. The whole labyrinth and Leviathan in the sky was matte work, was beautiful glass paintings by an industry legend, Clive Colley, who had worked with Powell and Pressburger in the 40s and 50s and had been based at Pinewood for decades. And those glass shots were the glass shots we were always going to have. So I'm sure if you got hold of Chris Figg and his chief finance officer for the thing, I'm sure, in fact, yes, there would probably be we would have had a second glass shot for a different vista of Hell from the left, but not really. You know, it was, in other words, no, I'm sorry, that was the best we could do. That's it wasn't it wasn't really a budgetary thing. It was that's what we got.
Yeah, good to know. So in the end, you know, what are your thoughts on how Hellraiser 2 turned out? And you know, back to that whole thing of you know, oh, the first album was the best. You know, what were your thoughts on how it compared to the original?
Nice trap, using my own words. To very good, very good, Mike. Well, I think it came out pretty good. I am fond. I was fond of the movie then. I remember, because the interesting thing is, again, as I'm sure you know, unless you're a very strange artist in whatever field, you don't go back and read your old books. You don't go back and watch your old movies. Again, to go to the band analogy, I don't know if they play their old albums. That's easier, of course, because you can put an album on and do something else. So maybe musicians do regularly listen to their older work, although I suspect not. But the truth is, yeah, I'm saying I still think Hellbound's a good movie. I don't know. I haven't watched it. I think the last time I watched it was when I had to do an audio commentary, and that's 14 years ago. But I will say, leaving my opinion out of it, time has been very kind to the movie, particularly in comparison to Hellraiser. As you say, first one's the best, and then when the movie came out, the genre press reaction was a little mixed. People did make some invidious comparisons with the first one and say, I think in some ways, I don't want to badmouth my former countrymen, but it was the British genre press, I think, because they knew Tony was an American. And I think there was a sort of assumption that, oh, they've taken away a homegrown British classic and given it to, I mean, I don't think necessarily they realized that the first movie was financed by New World as well. And that Tony had been involved as a production supervisor from New World. So there was some sort of meh reaction. A lot of some critics, and certainly a lot of fans, were very mad at me because I'd had this was the thing in the letters to Fangoria, you know, Atkins seems to think that his creation, Dr. Chenard, could beat Pinhead in a fight. And I didn't think Chenard could beat Pinhead in a fight, but I did think that after Kirsty had reminded Pinhead of his humanity, he would be weakened sufficiently to allow. Anyway, so there were some people that were mad at the movie. But, oh, and the mainstream press, as opposed to the genre press, hated the movie because it was so gory for its time. It was so gory and so in your face. Well, I won't go into that, but yeah, the bourgeois press, the middle class press, did not like us or care for what we had to do. But over time, I'm very touched to say, Hellraiser fans specifically, horror movie fans in general, fans of 80s horror, I guess, they now routinely, a lot of them still hate Hellraiser 3, and most of them realize Hellraiser 4 was messed up in production, but they've been very kind and forgiving to Hellraiser 2. And usually when they do these, again, I know we're talking big fish, tiny pond, but when within that tiny pond they do these polls for what are the good Hellraiser movies, Hellraiser 2 is right up there with the first one. It occasionally beats Hellraiser, so you'll get the poll where Hellbound is number 1, Hellraiser is number 2. It's very rarely anything else. It's always those two at the top, but I'm sort of touched that Hellbound gets in there to jockey for position with I mean, for my money, the original is still, it is, see, I was telling the truth. The first album is the best. I do, the first movie is a very specific, groundbreaking original. And, we couldn't hope to compete with that. But people seem, as the longer time passes, the fonder people seem to be of Hellbound, for which I'm simply grateful.
Yeah. So you mentioned Hellraiser 3. So I was watching the behind the scenes documentary this morning about Hellraiser 3, and they mentioned that New World went under after Hellraiser 2, and then that kind of had an effect on Hellraiser 3, because I think the rights to the films got sold. What do you remember about all that drama, and when did you what was that process like, just even trying to get that film made?
Well, the movie was called Hell on Earth, and Hell on Earth it certainly was. I remember very well, Michael, because it was the New World did go bust, not immediately after Hellraiser 2. They waited until we were 2 weeks into pre-production on Hellraiser 3, fully written and budgeted and about to shoot at Pinewood. And then New World went bust. So everybody was out of a job. Interestingly, that's not the Hellraiser 3 you eventually saw, because yes, as you mentioned in passing there was a whole complicated issue. It's a very clean transference of rights in terms of the franchise. One of the former owners of New World, a guy called Larry Coppin, when New World went under, the various spoils were delivered to the various departing owners. And Larry Coppin was the guy who was given the Hellraiser franchise. So that was very clear and simple, legal contractual thing. The Hellraiser franchise, the rights to that belonged to Larry Coppin. But because of the way business, I know nothing about business. I've never had a real job in my life, but apparently because of the way businesses are structured, the rights to a franchise do not automatically convey the rights to a specific project for which other parties had paid money. So Larry Coppin had the rights to Hellraiser and therefore the right to make a Hellraiser 3. He didn't have the rights to the script I'd written for the Old Order at New World. So that was just dead. We couldn't use that script. So we had to come up with a new one. But that's only the half of it. The one that I'd written that then got scuppered when New World went under was the third take on Hellraiser 3, but the first that had gone to full script. About 20 years ago, I wrote an article on the 6 Hellraiser 3s. I'll be happy to send you a link to the article just for your own amusement if you want to see it. But there'd been a couple of takes that New World had approved and then didn't. I'll keep this short for an interview. As I say, it was, it's a 3,000 word article. The movie you ended up seeing as Hellraiser 3 was the fifth of the 6 takes. The one that nearly got shot that was completed in script form was the third. Then there was another one. And then there was the fifth, which eventually, through a set of complicated circumstances, then jumped over what was going to have been the sixth, and was the one that was eventually shot in High Point, North Carolina. So yes, it was very complicated. And weirdly, I mean, looking back, the gap doesn't seem that big. I think Hellbound came out in 1988 and Hellraiser 3, it came out in late 88 even. In fact, with what struck me at the time as not smart marketing, it came out on Christmas Eve, 1988. Not sure it was a Christmas movie. And Hellraiser 3 came out in 1991. Now, to us at the time, because everything had collapsed and we'd all gone on to other projects, both literary and cinematic. So by the time we were doing Hellraiser 3, it really felt like, wow, so much time has passed. I look back at it now and it's like, that seems entirely normal. You know, a mere 2.5 years after that movie, this movie comes out. But it did feel like a long time then, especially, I guess, for low budget horror series, that probably was a reasonable gap. But yeah, so yes, it was a long, complicated nightmare, followed by a really pleasant shoot with a great cast and crew, a lot of local people from North Carolina working on it. So my memory of the actual production of the actual Hellraiser 3, pretty golden. My memory of the 2.5 years it took us to get from wrapping Hellraiser 2 to shooting Hellraiser 3, that's, you know, not so good. But as I say, I mean, I was doing other things, as everybody was. It's not like we were sitting, fretting and worrying. But yeah, that's what happened.
Yeah, and during that time, Clive released Nightbreed, which
Right.
that has a whole crazy history to it, and eventually years later they did the director's cut. Sure. So were you guys in touch at that time? Was he sharing all of that with you about, like, you're not going to believe what they did to my film? I mean, what are your memories of that whole drama? And
no, I worked on Nightbreed. I was a second unit director on Nightbreed. So yeah, I was.
Oh, so you actually lived it? Okay.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it wasn't my movie, so I didn't live the nightmare the way the way Chris and Clive lived it. But yeah, I was. There were 3 units. I want to be clear. There was. Obviously, Clive did the main unit. I assume you and your audience are familiar with filmmaking terms and stuff. A unit is the crew that shoots scenes, and nearly every movie, except micro-budget movies, have at least 2 units. Sometimes you have 3. Nightbreed was relatively low budget to have 3 units, but we did because we had so many monsters. And traditionally, the second unit doesn't get to work with the leads of the movie. I mean, it would be what you would imagine. The main unit is under charge of the director of the picture, in this case, Clive. And the second unit usually does pickup shots, busy shots, action shots, fill-in shots, you know. We had 3 units. A guy called Andy Armstrong, who'd worked with us on Hellbound, did what we were calling the action unit, which was basically, Andy was the younger brother of a guy called Vic Armstrong, who was a legendary stunt director and stunt arranger in the UK. I worked a lot for Hollywood Pictures too. So Andy was in charge primarily of the fight between Boone and Decker. I remember at one point a slightly mean joke by Gabriele Martinelli, who had been brought on as a producer. I made some reference to the action unit sequence, and Gabriele said, "Oh, you mean Andy's show reel?" Because I think he did spend about 2 weeks shooting that one fight, because I think he wanted a bit of his brother's action. But he did a lot of the physical action stuff. And I use these terms loosely. Again, I want to be clear to any civilians out there. When I say I was in charge of, Clive's in charge of it. The director of any movie is in charge of the movie, of the shoot. And then the second unit and third unit directors are entrusted, let's say, with being temporarily in charge of the bit. I was entrusted with a lot of the Midian footage, not the fun stuff with the leads, but it was actually great. It was, I just worked, again, with my friends from Image Animation. I just shot a lot of the everyday life in Midian stuff, would sort of walk around, film this monster, film that monster, have a little background monster action going on which we knew would intercut with what the main unit was shooting between Boone and Laurie and Narcisse, the guy who pulls his face, Narcisse, I think.
Yep.
And I got to do a few more interesting things. Got to work a little with Malcolm Smith, who played Ashbury in his transformation scenes. But yeah, I was there throughout. And again, it's mixed memories. A lot of the problems Clive had were post-production. It was when, was it Fox who distributed? I'm blanking. It was a Morgan Creek production,
right,
but
Morgan
I think
Creek.
it was Fox that were, held the purse strings. So the recutting and Clive losing a lot of the footage he wanted, and the reshoots, some of which people are very fond of, because some of that involves a lot of David Cronenberg killing people, and people like that, let's not forget. And that wasn't in, I mean, some of it was, but that wasn't necessarily in the original cut. So the shoot itself, I won't lie to you, it was fraught because it was going over budget and over schedule pretty much from the get-go, which is never a good situation, because you make the financiers nervous and then they put pressure on you. And unfortunately, what it meant was that, I don't know, in my memory, I want to say halfway through production, but it might have been 2/3 of the way through. Chris Figg, not to put too fine a point on it, took a bullet for Clive and was removed from the picture, which is when either Fox or Morgan Creek put the aforementioned Gabriella Martinelli in charge. And again, it's 30 years since I've seen these things. I think she gets the sole producer credit on the movie. I don't think Chris ended up with the credit that he should have. This is nothing against Gabriella, who was a lot of fun and very good at her job. And but she was brought in to replace our pal Chris, but it wasn't her fault. So that was the worst part of the shoot, was the over schedule and over budget reissues resulted in the loss of Chris. But yeah, so yes, I remember Nightbreed very well. It was, Chris, and because sadly the plan had been, Chris and Clive wanted to set themselves up as the new Hammer. Do you know the company Hammer Films? They were they were the big horror company in the UK in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, but primarily mid 50s to late 60s was that's where the Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing movies come from. And Chris and Clive wanted to be a UK-based production company that would be the equivalent of Hammer. And they'd done Hellraiser, we'd done Hellbound, we were doing Nightbreed, we were going to do the other Hellraiser 3, the one that didn't work. And that all went to hell. So that is unfortunate and sad. But again, what happens to the human beings involved in the creation of a collaborative work of art shouldn't, though it's human nature to allow it to, shouldn't have any impact on one's reaction to the work itself. So Nightbreed, the movie, is what it is, regardless of whether there had been unpleasantnesses or frustrations during its making. But yeah, I mean, obviously Clive has spoken a lot of his frustration with the first theatrical cut of the movie. And as you say, what is it now, about 5-6 years ago, they finally put that director's cut together? Maybe even more. Is it?
Yeah, I think it was 2014 it came out.
Wow, 8 years. Okay.
Yeah, but hey, at least it came out. So I mean, that was pretty great that it saw the light of day. Right. So anyway, so you were talking about how the filming Hellraiser 3 was a great experience, and once it finally happened, and you got to be in it. You got to be one of the Cenobites. I mean, what was that like? I've heard lots of stories from people about the application of the makeup and how that can be a bit arduous. But what was it like for you getting a chance to be in front of the camera?
Well, it was fine, and I usually make the joke there about, actors, they whine too much about the makeup. It was a breeze. But the difference for me was I didn't have the 4 hours in the chair that Doug had to go through. The barbed wire Cenobite, Barbie, as we call him, was essentially a mask. I mean, I don't want to downplay Bob's work on that, but it was a pre-made, so I could just pull it on and then have a mere half hour in the chair while Bob, finalized and fixed it up. I also wore a fat suit as Barbie, which I sadly would no longer need to wear. If they wanted to bring Barbie back, I'm now the right size to play him. So, but not to be flippant. No, it was great. I'm a monster kid. I grew up reading famous. I was born in the mid to late 50s. Well, I sound like I'm avoiding the issue like an actor. I was born in 1955. So I was prime target for famous monsters of Filmland magazine, for the emergence of old horror movies being shown regularly on TV. I was that monster kid generation. So getting to be a monster on screen was just, the old cliche, if I could go back and tell my 11-year-old self, he would be thrilled. And indeed he would have. So it was great. It only happened, by the way, because again, without getting too much into the trials and tribulations behind the scenes, Tony Randall had originally been going to direct Hellraiser 3. It was going to be the writer-director team from Hellbound were going to do this. And Tony was fired, I don't know, like 3.5 weeks before shooting began in North Carolina. And there were some bullshit press releases at the time, but it was a personality clash and a power move by the producer Larry Mortoff, who just wanted him off. And they brought on another Englishman, a guy with whom I had plenty of people in common, though he and I had never met or worked together, a guy called Tony Hickox. I always have to be careful to keep my Tonys straight when I tell these stories. But so they flew Tony out to North Carolina, I guess the same time as I'm trying to think if I'd been there. They flew me out to finish up the production draft. It's sort of the same time as Tony. I can't remember which one of us got there first. Anyway, again, I was very lucky. He and I hit it off very well. And we've stayed friends and worked together a lot since then. But the theory was, as with most productions, that they'd flown me out for prep because they wanted the script polished. But they weren't going to keep me because writers, unlike TV, writers don't automatically stay throughout a shoot. In fact, it's very rare that a writer is present. Again, I've been very lucky, I haven't done a movie for a long time. I was very lucky in my screenwriting days that I pretty much was present throughout the shoots for all my movies except Hellraiser 4. Why am I saying this? Oh, so the producers assumed that, you know, I would be flying home pretty much after the first couple of days of the cameras rolling. And Tony Hickox said, you can't send him home. You know, you just brought, you know, because he had not been involved through no fault of his own. He had not been involved in development, obviously. He'd had 2 weeks to get used to the idea that he was shooting this movie. So he said, you've got to keep him. You know, I want the writer, keep him here. And they said, perfectly reasonably, because you got to remember these are low, not what we mean these days by low budget, not micro budget, but they weren't what was then a big budget. It wasn't a $40 million movie. It was like a $4 million movie. So it's a low budget movie. They didn't have the budget to keep me and give me a room and feed me and give me a per diem because they budgeted for the writer being there. Anyway, that's very inside baseball, I'm sorry. But the point was, Tony Hickox said to them in a stroke of genius, he said, all right, fine. Well, I'll cast him as one of the Cenobites because you've got a budget for an actor, haven't you? And they were forced to admit that, yes, they did. So I guess nobody lost a job. I want to be clear. It's not that we'd had an actor who was going to be the barman and the barbed wire Cenobite. But there was a theoretical someone. So I guess in a way I did some poor bugger out of a job. But that way they could do it. They could officially keep me there as an actor. I use the term loosely, but we're actually keeping me there as a writer. But having said all that, yeah, it was great to wear monster makeup and chase Terry Farrell down the streets of North Carolina and breathe fire. It's fantastic.
And you mentioned Bob Keane and Image Animation earlier. The thing I found really interesting about them is obviously the work was excellent, but they were kind of almost like a little like family unit where they worked on all these films together. And you know, what are your thoughts on their work? I mean, because back lots of horror fans say practical effects are just more effective, right, than CGI, because you can always tell that it's CGI. It just looks bad. So what are your thoughts on just the work that they brought to the table? I mean, you mentioned Hellbound, they had to do it real quick. So just, you know, whether it be the original one, Nightbreed, or any of the others, what are your thoughts on their work?
I mean, again, I speak from a position of complete prejudice because I love those guys. But I will attempt to be objective. No, I mean, I think they're spectacularly good. It was Bob. And by the way, you're right to make a family analogy. And just like families, it's not like there weren't internecine fights and fallouts and people quitting and new family members coming in. So in other words, it wasn't the same 9 guys or girls from the beginning to the end, but there were, as sort of, you know, what would you call him, ringmaster, if nothing else, Bob had and corralled an amazing team of astonishingly gifted visual artists, sculptors, drawers. Again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, Michael, but the art of application of the makeup is as important. It's a separate skill. You have some people who are superb concept artists who can design the creature, but they might suck at sculpting. So you need a brilliant sculptor to make the thing from which the mask will be pulled. But the guy who sculpted it mightn't be any good at application. So there's all these various levels of skills. And Bob had great pencil artists, great concept artists, great storyboard artists, great sculptors, great mold pullers, and great appliers. And I'm tempted to like reel off a list of names, but I will inevitably forget some and then I will feel terrible. But you can look up the credits on, well, I mean, let's just say on the movies we've discussed, on Hellraiser, on Hellbound, on Hellraiser 3, and on Nightbreed. Those are all Image Animation. By Hellraiser 4, we had a couple of alumni, like Gary Tunnicliffe was still on Hellraiser 4, he's significantly younger than the rest of us. So he was a kid who came on board very late during Hellraiser 3. But by Hellraiser 4, he'd become Pinhead's main application. The Pinhead makeup, by the way, the one guy I should probably credit is the great Jeff Portas. Bob was, like I say, the ringmaster and was great at it himself. But the Pinhead makeup and the application of the Pinhead makeup originally was Jeff Portas, who had been Bob's partner for a long time. But their work is spectacular. And you know, people who are interested in this sort of thing should go and look at the credits on those movies in particular. I'm so tempted to name some of the Hellraiser alumni, by the way, are now double Oscar winners. I guess I should, so I can name Mark Coulier, because Mark Coulier now has 2 Oscars. So, so you know, it's a good grad school to come from the image animation Hellraiser talent pool. So I think their work is fantastic, but obviously I do speak from a little position of prejudice. But I would like to pick up on the point you said about practical effects versus CGI. I'm not automatically opposed to new technologies, even though I'm now an older gentleman, and older people had traditionally thought it was better in my day. The steam guitar was better than the electric. But so I'm not at all. I like the new, but it is interesting to me, almost as an objective observer, although it's also nice for the egos of people who worked in the 80s and 90s. It is very interesting to me that there is a whole new generation of people who are remarkably fond of 80s and 90s horror right now. I mean, it might fall out of favor again, of course, and I can't help but feel, as you implied, that this is because they get a feeling of reality. That's a real actor. Now, admittedly, in a suit, you know, in makeup, but it's a real person moving in real time against a real background, wearing real pieces, you know, or pieces in paint are more convincing on a real person than the most brilliantly executed CGI. And I'm not suggesting that there isn't CGI that fools us all, that we look at it and we think, wow, they really shot that in the desert. And then it turns out, no, it was a green screen. So CGI is a marvelous technology and people are really good at it. But you know, scientifically, I have no basis for saying this, but in the same way that people said and have now sort of been proved right by time that vinyl was a warmer medium than digital, you know, CDs or DVD sound. I think, I don't know, people seem fun. Maybe we just made better movies. There's always that, but I don't think it is just that. I think there's a certain kick that kids that grew up only with CGI, and maybe especially the CGI in video games, which is even more, you know, paint boxily than the movies. They see something or feel something in the 80s and 90s practical effects movies that maybe they don't get. So
yeah, absolutely. So with Hellraiser 3, so prior to this interview, I watched Hellraiser 1, 2, 3, 4, and Wishmaster.
Well,
I'd
I
seen
can only
before.
apologize.
No, that's fine. But I have to tell you, watching them back, I actually thought that Hellraiser 3 had a more cohesive narrative from beginning to end than Hellraiser 2, even though Hellraiser 2 gets a lot of credit, because I was like watching Hellraiser 2 and I'm like, wait a minute, this is clearly not the same house. When they cut the gauze off of Julia, why does she magically have skin? Like there were certain things I'm like, don't necessarily make sense. Whereas Hellraiser 3, everything made sense. Whether or not you like it is a different story, but it seemed like everything was logical. Where with 2, you kind of had to work you had to work with what you had, because it was a lot of it came from the first one.
Right.
Where 3 felt more of like a clean slate. So like 30 years
Well,
later, what are
yeah.
your thoughts on, how 3 turned out, how people regard it, and I guess just again comparing it to the previous ones?
Sure. Um, well, thank you for the heroic viewing session you put yourself through. Um, yeah, I would say I should get this out of the way first. I acknowledge that an awful lot of people who consider themselves hardcore Hellraiser fans really don't like Hellraiser 3 for a very specific reason. I don't think they would disagree. Maybe, how would I know? I suspect they might not, if they were reasonable people, might not disagree with what you just said, that Hellraiser 3 is more cohesive narratively or whatever. But they object for a very specific reason. They think that 1 and 2 have a kind of, I don't want to paraphrase for them, but a sort of darkness and seriousness of intent, whereas Hellraiser 3 is a little more commercially slick, obviously one doesn't use the word glib about movies, but sort of the pictorial equivalent of glib, that it's slicker, more commercial. Again, a lot of loudmouth Brits would say, I was a little more Americanized. Which is a ridiculous insult. They don't mean Americanized, they mean commercialized. And I would have to say, on the most simplistic level, I'd have to say, yeah, they got us. It is a slicker, more commercial movie in look, feel, and possibly intent than number 2. But it well, there is no but. If if they feel that, they feel that. But again, there are people, obviously there are also people who are very, very fond of the movie, and I'm very fond of the movie. And I think, well, again, I don't want to get too inside baseball and too nuts and boltsy, but they're usually objecting to a sort of look rather than, they hate the pseudo Cenobites without quite grasping that they are pseudo Cenobites. Again, I don't want to bog your viewers down in detail. Pinhead is briefly divorced from hell as a consequence of Hellraiser 2. So the Cenobites, the new Cenobites that the hardcore fans take pleasure in attacking, they're handmade, as Pinhead himself says in the movie. They are handmade, a shadow of my former troops, he says. But some people find them silly. And one of them does have CDs that he ejects from his head and throws at people, which I grant you is a little silly, but it's also fun. And I think it's got some of Doug's best work in, and I think even the people who don't like the movie, and again, I realize we're talking about a small hardcore group, but even they acknowledge that Doug does good work in it. Everybody likes the Black Mass scene, the scene in the church where Pinhead mocks the Eucharist, the rites, and I think there's. I've said this before in an interview, but I realized that if they regard Hellraiser 1 and Hellraiser 2 as kind of the Gospels, then in a way Hellraiser 3 is a break from it. So if they think that is canonical Hellraiser, then I can understand that Hellraiser 3 isn't a good Hellraiser movie if they regard only the tone and flavor of 1 and 2 as canonical. But I would say, and again, the years have helped give perspective on this. I will say, looking at it, and Again, I haven't seen it since I did an audio commentary, but I did an audio commentary for that more recently than I did for the others. So I saw that, I don't know, when did the Arrow box set go? So 7 or 8 years ago, I probably saw
Yeah, it was a great box set.
Yeah, apparently they never sent me one. I did them a commentary. I still haven't seen it, but I
Oh, it's
gather
beautiful. Come
I
on, they got to
gather
give you
it's
one.
really nice. Um, but what I did, and I might actually have said it in that, because that might have been the first time I realized it, and I said it in the commentary, that maybe it isn't to the hardcore fans a good Hellraiser movie, but it's a very good, although technically it's 91, it's a very good 80s horror movie. It looks and feels like 80s horror. And I should give, by the way, I should give Tony Hickox, credit or blame, depending whether you like that slick commercial look. They accuse us of trying to turn it into Freddy, I think was the standard thing, that we were chasing a Nightmare on Elm Street vibe. Which, by the way, was funny because the sequence I mentioned earlier where I did get to chase Terry Farrell down the street breathing fire was shot in Greensboro, North Carolina, on Elm Street. We shot that nightmare on Elm Street.
That's great.
Which was funny. What was I saying? Yeah, yeah, so I think I don't assign blame, I assign credit to Tony Hickox for giving it that slick 80s commercial horror filmmaking look and feel. People are free not to like that. But there was no betrayal of or at least no intentional betrayal of the franchise at heart. And again, as with 2, time's been kind and people are more forgiving and people seem fond of it now. But yeah, they think CD Head is silly and Camera Head is silly. Yeah. Nobody thinks Barbie's silly. He's cool. He breathes fire. So
yeah, well, that's good. At least you're the popular one.
Yeah.
So with Hellraiser 2 and 3, I noticed that, and horror movies tend to do this as more sequels appear. Mm-hmm. It took a look back into kind of the humanity or the backstory of Pinhead, right? Same thing with the Halloween movies. They try to get into, well, why is he who he is? And how did he arrive at this place? Now, some people would argue that providing the backstory takes away from the scariness, because not knowing makes it scary. And that if you reveal too much, then people kind of identify or cheer for the villain. And, all of a sudden it becomes campy or humorous and it loses, its kind of authenticity, if you will. What are your thoughts on that? Do you, is there a balance to strike there? Do you think the backstory serves a purpose, or, what are your thoughts on
that? Great question. No, I think that's exactly right. I think that is the thin ice on which one has to skate, for sure, because in a way, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You can't just make the same movie again. Pinhead pops up every now and then, says something gnomic and threatening and goes away. You're sort of obliged to say, well, wait a minute, who is this guy? But you're exactly right. You can't take the mystery. Well, the risk is that you take the mystery away and undercut the power. And it can certainly get campy. Or the other, I'm always cautious. I try never to badmouth other creators. So, but there is a relevant example, I think. So I want to be very clear that my veneration for the Thomas Harris novels, Red Dragon and Silence of the Lambs, is second to nobody's. They're magnificent. But then he fell in love with Hannibal. And we all sort of weirdly fell in love with Hannibal. And the later, well, who am I to badmouth Thomas Harris? But I felt that by the last 2 books, it was a weird position to put the reader in. Like, are we rooting for this guy? We like him because he's smarter and cooler, but he eats people. So it's one thing to, of course, to love your movie monster. It's a different thing for the creator to fall in love with them so much that they lose track. There's a famous review by, I'm pretty sure it was Martin Amis, of the third book, Hannibal, who pointed this out. I mean, I don't think he made that point about falling in love with it. Anyway, what he pointed out was that there was a scene in which Hannibal gets mad with a baby on a plane because the baby and his parents are sort of graceless and classless and noisy and disgusting. And Hannibal, of course, is a model of refinement and culture. And as Amos points out, I'm paraphrasing, he basically said in the review, so let me get this straight. We're meant to sympathize with the serial killing cannibal rather than a baby who makes a noise on a plane. There's something wrong here. And he's got a point. And we all fell in love with Pinhead. I wanted to write great lines for Doug and give them to him. But sorry, long story short, but that is the thin ice on which you have to skate, as I say. I would like to feel, I certainly cannot make claims if it doesn't work for people. I think I humanized him just enough by giving him the Elliot Spencer backstory. It wasn't simply thrown out there for us to feel sympathy for the person who became Pinhead, but because I put it in the context of a conflict. You know, he's at war with himself. His former self is at war with his monster. There, won't bore you with an apologia for what I did, but I will go back to saying what I said earlier. Thank God for Doug, because one of the ways in which that problem can be avoided is if you've got a fantastic actor delivering that stuff for you. So Doug, you know, could make those speeches I gave him about the losses of the First World War, could lend them gravity and dignity, and perhaps avoid the issue of making it too, well, he certainly didn't make it campy. There's an argument that Act 3 of Hellraiser 3 is campy. We kill a bunch of teenagers in a nightclub, set fire to cops in the street, you know, and there's some, you know, perhaps one-liners that land with a thud. Ready for your close-up, Joey. So, you know, I'm still fond of the occasional one-liners that do land with a thud. So, you know, arguably there's a camp element in there, but I don't think Pinhead ever becomes camp. And I think also, you know, one of the things as well is that we had a clean break. The Hellraiser 1 and 2 told the Cotton family saga. It wrapped up Kirsty and Larry and Frank and Julia. So Hellraiser 3 was, you know, brand new people, new story. And as well as Doug, we were, I speak from a position of prejudice, of course, but we were very lucky with, just as we've been lucky with Doug and Ashley Lawrence in the first two, we were very lucky in Hellraiser 3. Terry Farrell, Paula Marshall, Kevin Bernard as our new young human leads. Well, two of them didn't remain human, but yeah, Terry, Paula, and Kevin were great. So it is a different feel and a different tone and a different flavor. But like I say, damned if you do, damned if you don't, because if we'd just done another Hellraiser that was thematically and tonally the same as the first two, then we would have been guilty of staleness. And so my argument would be better to try for a different thing, whether it succeeds or fails.
Agreed. So Bloodline. I was expecting when I went back to watch that for it to be a bit of a mess because of the history associated with it.
Sure.
And I was actually surprised if you showed that to just a normal person, not some sort of Hellraiser, Clive Barker fanatic, they would just assume, oh, okay, this is the way the movie was intended to be. Like
Sure.
it's just, it makes sense from beginning to end and everything seems logical. Yet the history of it's pretty crazy. So I mean, what are your and then you have Harvey Weinstein who's kind of tied into the whole thing because of Miramax.
Sure.
So what are your memories of Bloodline and that saga?
Well, they were all good memories until they weren't. The development was fine. We had, I mean, what history is necessary before I say this? Clive had not been involved with Hellraiser 3 because he couldn't come to financial terms with Larry Coppin's company. Once the movie was made, Larry Coppin's company, Transatlantic, leased it or licensed it to Miramax for distribution, at which point Miramax, not to put too fine a point, that it wrote Clive a check so that they could put Clive Barker Presents at the top of the movie. And again, as with Hellbound, because he was then back on board, he was involved a little bit in editing and post-production on number 3. But more importantly, Miramax then made an offer to Larry Coppin, not simply to license the next thing, but to buy the franchise from him. So Miramax became the owners of the franchise. So they were going to make Hellraiser 4, which they had, although you get the Miramax Dimension logo at the beginning of Hellraiser 3, they were simply the distributor of the movie. They hadn't been involved in the production itself, but they were going to produce and make, as it was then called, Hellraiser 4. We hadn't called it Bloodline yet. So in a way, it was very nice. It was sort of like old home week because Clive was back on board. So just as with Hellraiser 2, not as with Hellraiser 3, he and I came up with the basic idea, the log line, the story, which, and both of us thought, by the way, that it would definitely be the last one, because back then, I guess, you weren't used to movie series getting up into double figures. We thought we were lucky to have had 3. And we also thought that we'd wrapped everything up. Pinhead had been put back together. Everything was as it was, So we knew that in a weird way, we had to bookend, or we probably didn't use that word immediately, but we knew that we had to, in a way, comment on the trilogy, because we weren't expecting to have needed to make this movie. We didn't know there was going to be a 4. And I think in Clive and I's initial, Clive and my, I always get the I and the my mixed up there. My teachers would be mad at me. In our initial conversation, I think I, not consciously with a view to doing it, I think I used the term bookend, and Clive said, right, we can surround the original trilogy or something. We were throwing ideas back and forth. And what emerged was, we want to do a movie that is both a prequel and a sequel to the existing trilogy, as we were then calling it. I mean, it hadn't been planned as a trilogy, obviously. So we wanted a prequel and a sequel, bookends, framing device, whatever you want to call it. And then, and again, I want to give full credit to Clive, said, well, we'll do 3 different time periods, which I thought was great. And what he originally suggested was Victorian London, present day, and the future. And the bit I can take credit for is I reminded him, because he makes so many things he can sometimes forget. I reminded him that he had, in the novella The Hellbound Heart, mentioned that the original maker of the box was an 18th century French toy maker called Le Marchand. And I said, let's not do Victorian London. Why don't we do pre-revolutionary France and tell the toy maker's story and that family's story through. And then again, not hearing what I'm saying, I said, like the Bloodline with the box, and Clive says, that's the title, Hellraiser Bloodline. Yes, let's pitch that. So, and it was, everybody loved everybody right then. Bob Weinstein was very fond of us. So I went in and pitched literally just that to him. It wasn't like we had the story sorted out. I went in and said, baffled him with bullshit, basically, bookend, framing, prequel, sequel, toy maker's family, bloodline, this, past, present, future, all meeting in, and Bob, who was our friend at that point, said, fantastic, you're hired, make a deal, write me a script. So I did, and it was all good. And Bob, and yes, Harvey was present at some of the meetings, but fortunately, Dimension, which was their horror imprint, was very much Bob's baby. So we dealt for the most part with Bob, not Harvey. But I can't pretend I didn't sit next to Harvey Weinstein in several story meetings. And also at the, God, can I even say this out loud? You weren't allowed to smoke in Miramax's building. And I was a smoker back in those days, as many of us were. It's a terrible habit, kids, don't do it. But I was a smoker, and I couldn't smoke in Miramax unless Harvey was in town, because Harvey smoked. So whenever there was a story meeting, I would just plant myself next to Harvey and share his ashtray and smoke through the... Let's leave aside the fond memories of Harvey Weinstein. And so anyway, they really, Bob really liked the script. They were very gung-ho for it. We looked around for various people to direct it. I mean, it's not like, I magically wrote one superb draft and they were going to shoot that. There was the usual development process. I wrote, I think, 4 drafts probably. And at once, I'm not sure what percentage of your audience are horror fans per se, or just movie fans generally, Michael, but for the horror movie fans out there, we nearly got Stuart Gordon to direct it, which would have been very interesting. I had a couple of meetings with Stuart. He's the Reanimator guy. And,
yeah, did amazing.
A lot of things. And Stuart was great. But I'm not privy to why the business deal didn't work, but they couldn't come to terms with Stuart. But then great news, there was sad news we couldn't get Stuart, and then great news, Kevin Yeager, another great special effects guy. I don't want to stroke, fell in love with the script, his phrase, not mine, and said he wanted to do it. So that was great too. And then we started shooting. And then it all went to hell. They'd had no experience at making horror movies, low budget horror movies. And they hired a producer for Kevin who had only worked on big budget movies, not as a producer, as a unit production manager. And this was her shot at producing. And she had no idea how to budget. She, well, I don't need to badmouth her, but Kevin had his legs cut out from under him almost from the first day of shooting. And he thought he was going to be able to get this and couldn't. And they were ripping pages out of the script and shortening the schedule. And it was a horrible mess. And eventually Kevin had had enough and Well, I mean, I quit first. They kept calling me up to basically dismember my baby, cut this scene, cut this scene. And I tried to take one for the team for a couple of weeks. And then this is how long ago this is, Michael. I resigned by fax. I don't know if you remember fax machines, but they were a precursor. Anyway, so I resigned by fax halfway through the shoot. And Kevin went the distance on the primary shoot, but before any of the pickups, he quit and made a permanent enemy out of Bob Weinstein by saying he was going to take the Alan Smithy credit, which is in case your viewers don't know, is a DGA pre-approved pseudonym that directors can take if they feel that the movie does not reflect what they would have wished it to be. So Hellraiser 4 is an Alan Smithy movie. If you look him up, he has a very interesting filmography, range of genres, range of tones. So it was a mess. But it's interesting what you say, because it's true. You know, I was mad at them. Kevin's mad at them. They're mad at us. Everybody hates everybody by now. The reshoots, which again, I refused to write pages for, and certainly Kevin wasn't coming back to shoot them. But again, no disrespect or offense to the people who did. A writer called Rand Ravitch wrote a couple of new scenes, and a director called Joe Chappelle shot them. I mean, not enough to earn Writers Guild or DGA credit, but there was some reshoots involving them. And I guess you're right. Despite everybody hating everybody and having spent 20 years bitching about the finished result, it's not that the movie doesn't make sense. It makes a different kind of sense and tells a marginally different story than we originally intended. But yeah, it sort of hangs together in as much as it does. Doug is good. Angelique, the Angelique Cenobite, especially, again, Gary Tunnicliffe's work. Kevin's a brilliant effects guy, but although he had his own shop, he did bring Gary on as an image alum. And the Angelique look is a Gary Tunnicliffe job, and it's one of the great Cenobites. Certainly better than CD Head. No offense, Eric, if you're watching, Eric Wilhelm, who played CD Head. But Angelique looks hot, you know, gotta say it. So there are, you know, obviously there are pleasures to be had in it. It's difficult for me to see the pleasures, but I hear what you're saying. Yeah, it does. Miramax successfully Frankenstein together a slightly different but coherent narrative. Even so, I would say the movie has pacing problems, some performance problems, some tonal problems. So I don't think it's great, even though it's coherent. But again, you know, I'm so fond of so many of the people involved that it's always difficult for me. You know, Doug's great, as I say. The other cast members are great. Dan Lick did the music. Gary's there doing the effects, and I loved Kevin. Kevin and I got on immediately. But yeah, it was not a great experience. Beautiful experience up to the first couple of days of shooting. After that, not so much.
And I think it was just last year you released the original screenplay as a book, which I picked up and I'm reading currently, and so people could see, you know, what was that original script that Clive fell in love with, and so yeah, tell me about releasing that, and you know why you chose to do that. And in the introduction, you talk about why you didn't make it a novelization like you did with the Wishmaster, but you know, explain that for those who haven't read it yet.
Sure. Well, I didn't have the legal right to allow a novelization. Wishmaster was, I realized there had been Evil Genie movies before, so I always feel slightly pretentious and embarrassed when I say Wishmaster was an original. But what I mean by that is that it is legally and contractually an original, which meant that as a member of the Writers Guild, you have certain rights that come with that. So when the company Encyclopocalypse, who specialize in sort of retro novelizations of movies that didn't have novelizations, which is a terrific thing to do. And if your viewers are interested, they should go and check out Encyclopocalypse publications at their own website or on Facebook. They've reissued some genuine period novelizations, and they've commissioned new novelizations. Wishmaster was the first. They've also since done Vamp, a lot of, 80s and 90s, obviously. They've done Vamp, they've done Titan Find, they've done Scared to Death. They're going to be mad at me if I'm not plugging them. I can't remember, and a couple of others, and they will continue to do it. And the guy who novelized Wishmaster, Christian Francis, I want to give him credit to. He did a great job. And a few months after they'd done that, Mark Miller, who runs Encyclopocalypse, and Christian said, "Can we do it with Hellraiser Bloodline?" And I said, "Well, you can't, because although." Again, I don't want to get in the weeds about Writers Guild regulations and rights. And I had the publication rights to the screenplay because technically Hellraiser 4 was an original because I got the single written by credit. So any Writers Guild member has the automatic right to publish their screenplay. But Hellraiser, unlike Wishmaster, so leaving aside legal and contractual definitions of original, Hellraiser, unlike Wishmaster, clearly was based on existing material, also specifically literary material, because Clive had written The Hellbound Heart as a novella. This is very long-winded and boring, Michael, I'm sure, for you guys. I'm sorry. So in other words, I would have been happy to have given Encyclopocalypse the rights to novelize Hellraiser Bloodline, but not only would it have been legally gray, not necessarily, there might have been a loophole in there, but morally, it was like, Clive does not want other people writing Hellraiser novels, I don't think. Even if it's a Hellraiser novel based on his old mate Pete's screenplay. So I said to him, "Look, I can't, I'm sorry." And I thought, I said it as a joke, because you could always publish the script if you want, because I assumed, why would they do that? People don't publish scripts for mainstream consumption. But they said, "Oh, yes, please." So we did do the script, which I was very pleased about, because some people have been kind enough. People have been very kind about the book, which is great. And they've been kind enough to say, "Great, why don't you publish the scripts of Hellraiser 2 and Hellraiser 3 as well?" And the big difference is, I don't feel the need to, because the Hellraiser 2 you got, good or bad, is essentially the Hellraiser 2 I wrote. And the Hellraiser 3 you got, good or bad, is essentially the Hellraiser 3 I wrote. Bloodline, good or bad, is pretty different. I mean, it's the same story, obviously, but we'd all been so dissatisfied for years that I thought, well, yeah, that one I'd like people to read, to see the bits they didn't get. And I just don't feel the need to do that with Hellraiser. And I feel in a weird way it would be sort of insulting to the rest of my collaborators, specifically the directors, if I felt the need to put out the script as if they hadn't done a good job on bringing the script to life. Obviously, I don't mean any insult to Kevin by putting out the script of Bloodline, but I don't think he would be insulted, because he agrees with me that they didn't release the movie the way we would have wished it to have been seen. So that's a very long-winded answer, Michael. I'm sorry, but that's how that came to be, and people have been very kind, as I say, which is great.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I so Wishmaster. So we're talking about Wishmaster. Came out in 1997. Not only have you gotten to work with Clive Barker, but you get to work with Wes Craven. I mean, that's incredible. And the cast in that movie, my God, you had not only did you have Tony Todd, Robert Englund,
Yeah.
you know, you had Angus Scrimm narrating it.
That was the cherry. That was the cherry on top for me, because obviously that came later.
Yeah.
Obviously, the prologue speech had been written from the get-go, it was from first draft onwards, but we didn't need to record it before we shot the movie. So we'd already got, I thought it was, we'd already had a great party and got all those people. And then finally, when they were going to record the thing, we got Angus, and it was like, wow, now we got them all now.
Yeah.
I should have talked Doug into popping up somewhere, because as you say, we had Freddie, Robert Englund, we had Jason Kane Hodder, we had Reggie Bannister, we had Buck Flowers, Ted Raimi's in there, we had the Pazuzu statue, even that makes a cameo from The Exorcist, Candyman, as you say. So it would have been great if I could have snuck Doug in there. Maybe we could digitally insert him for an anniversary. Anyway, yes, full credit for getting those people does not go to me. That is Bob Kurtzman's Rolodex. Nobody under 40 knows what a Rolodex is, do they? Bob Kurtzman's address book is what I mean. Because Bob Kurtzman, who directed Wishmaster, was the K in KNB, another premier physical makeup effects house. So Bob had put makeup on all those people in previous projects, so he had their phone numbers. So I'd already written the movie as a kind of celebration of horror, because I think consciously or on, all of us, certainly me, but I think all of us who'd been involved in 80s and 90s horror had a sense that the mode was changing. Scream had already come out, for example. So the self-referential knowing horror movie was going to be in vogue for a while. Then it was followed by torture porn for a while. And Wishmaster, I don't want to overstate how conscious I was of this. Some of it was unconscious, but retrospectively looking at it, I see that Wishmaster is conscious or on a farewell kiss to that kind of character horror, character monster movie. Freddy, Jason, Candyman, Leatherface, Pinhead. We didn't have those people for quite a long time. I mean, obviously there are other, the Jeepers Creepers monster. Is he called the Creeper? I guess he is. And eventually even Saw became a monster character because of Jigsaw. Eventually you always come back to the masks and the cereal, you know, you got to have something merchandisable. I'm kidding. But so it was, in a way, although it was a 97 movie, it's kind of a valedictory to the 80s style. And I peppered the script with all kinds of wink, wink. All the names of all the characters and all the buildings are all horror authors. And I think it was in a conversation with Bob that, again, I don't know how conscious it was. It just started, but it became conscious. It was like, oh yeah, let's get him. It became this sense that it was a rap party for the decade. The only one I don't take credit for is Tony Todd, because Bob had not worked. Well, I should buy my time. I don't know if Bob had worked with him. I don't think he had, but because of the Candyman connection, I was asked to get Tony. So I got Tony, but everybody else was a direct consequence of Bob just having them in his address book. And they were all
Yeah,
happy to do it. It was great. Some of them came in just for a day. Some of them had bigger, but it was very nice to have all those faces in there. And while celebrating all those guys, I don't want to diss by omission the lovely and great Andy Divoff, who hadn't been a movie monster before, but who we got in, well, Bob again found him, brought him in as the Djinn. I think it was a recommendation from our friend John Esposito, I think. It was a recommendation from somebody to Bob. I don't want to give the wrong, I think it was John. And Andy was great and, clearly held his own with, obviously people make jokes about, well, the Djinn is the most powerful 90s movie monster because he kills Freddy and he kills Candyman and he kills Jason. So let me be clear to the zealots out there. Robert isn't playing Freddy, Kane isn't playing Jason, Tony isn't playing the Candyman. So the Djinn does not kill those characters. But yeah, he kills those actors. So. But anyway, he was great. He did. And as I was saying, as with Doug earlier, and as with Robert, as Freddy, obviously, you can write it as clever and as funny as you can, but if you don't get a really good actor to sell that shit, and so I looked at again with Andy. It was great.
yeah. And then, so what was it like? Did you have much interaction with Wes Craven? I mean, he was coming off of my favorite film of his, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and then Scream. He was like, kind of having like this renaissance, if you will. So, what was it like working with Wes on that? Not many people can say that they've had their work, produced by, Clive Barker and Wes Craven.
I'd never quite thought of it that way, but I'll make sure I introduce myself that way in future. It's no, you're right. Again, as I was defensive about Chris Figg earlier, I love Wes and I revere his work, but I want to be clear that the producer of the movie, the guy who was on set every day, well, again, not on set getting in Bob's way, but the guy who produced the movie was Clark Peterson, who worked for Pierre David. Pierre David's interesting as well. He was a French-Canadian producer who had produced some of Cronenberg's early movies. So again, you've got the lineage there. But so Wes was an executive producer. He wasn't the nuts and bolts producer all day, every day. That was Clark Peterson. So because often big names are big names for a reason, but I don't like, but producers are very important to the making of a movie. They don't make the movie. The writer writes it, the director directs it, but the producer produces it. It's a big job, a very multifaceted job. And unless they're a big name, the producer tends not to get talked about. So like I wanted to make sure people knew Chris Figg, I just want to make sure that people know Clark Peterson. Having said that, it was great. That and again, actually, as I'd said with Clive on Hellraiser 2 and 3, Wes's main involvement was in post-production. Bob always says how incredibly helpful and mentor-like Wes was in the editing room. So Bob certainly got to work with him. I'm jealous, Bob got to work with him in a way that I didn't really. Wes was, I always feel very awkward saying, somebody liked something. Wes was very complimentary about the script. He didn't really have many development notes on it. So I only got to meet him a couple of times before we shot the movie, and maybe 3 or 4 times during the shoot. and a couple of times I'd go into post-production when Bob was cutting and Wes would be there. So I will brag about the fact that I worked with Wes Craven, but I didn't get, down in there with Wes really in post, because he was an executive producer. So he was very, very, very kind and useful and helpful to Bob in the editing process, particularly. But yeah, it was what a sad loss that he went so relatively early. But
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
it's great to know my name is on a poster with his. Obviously, who wouldn't be pleased?
Oh. So you mentioned the novelization. What goes into that? I mean, it's interesting because lots of times back in the day, you'd have, and now actually they've kind of made a comeback. I love novelizations, but back in like I remember David Morrell talking about back in the 80s, you'd have lots of novelizations. He actually wrote novelizations to the Rambo sequels.
Yeah,
Uh,
right. I remember that happening.
right. But in this case, the movie already existed, and then years later,
Right.
the novelization came out instead of being a promotional tool to promote the film that was out in the theaters. So, what was that like, kind of having someone revisit your work? And was the author working closely with you? I mean, lots of times these novelizations kind of take a deeper dive or expand on the
Sure.
work.
Yeah.
But what was that process like, and what are your thoughts on the end result?
Oh, I'm very pleased with the end result. As I said earlier, Christian Francis was the guy who did it, and he's not the only guy doing it for Encyclopocalypse. I think Matt Serafini did the Scared to Death novelization, but Christian has done Vamp and Titan Find, and I'm 99% sure I'm right in saying that Wishmaster was the first one they did. But you're right; it's an odd thing. The novelization, the big boom in them in the 80s and 90s usually involved the novelizer being given a copy of the shooting script, sometimes not even the shooting script, sometimes an earlier draft, depending on how early they wanted to get the promotional machine up and running. I mean, again, just for the historical note for the scholars among your viewers, obviously the novelization did not begin in the 80s. Movies were novelized in the silent days. I was going to say France from the Opera, but of course that's an existing novel. What's the one I'm thinking of? London After Midnight was a Lon Chaney a lost Lon Chaney Sr. silent film, was novelized in the 1920s. Wings, the first Academy Award Best Picture winner, I think in 1928, was novelized. King Kong was novelized. They were all novelized as hardcovers, of course, and to our 30 years younger than me, to my, your, and younger generations, the novelization, what we picture is the mass market paperback. But they'd been around for a long time, as I say, King Kong, London After Midnight. Bonnie and Clyde was the first novelization I bought as a 12-year-old. Had a lot more sex in it, the novelization of Bonnie and Clyde. And I think a lot of novelizations did, especially in the 60s, I gather. But yeah, the boom was really the 80s. And the writers then would be, they might occasionally have seen a cut, not very rarely the finished movie. And primarily they would be working from a shooting script, not knowing what was going to happen in production, if some scenes were going to be cut, if some new scenes were going to be written. So you do get often not radically different takes, but there will be scenes in novelizations that simply aren't there in the movie. It doesn't mean the novelizer, I'm sure, is more than capable of making them up, but they wouldn't necessarily have made them up. They would have pulled them from whatever version of the script they were working from. My lost friend, the late great Dennis Etchison, did a couple of novelizations in the golden age of novelizations under the name Jack Martin. He did he do Halloween 2? He certainly did Halloween 3. I think he did Halloween 2, Halloween 3, Videodrome, and under his own name, he did The Fog. So what were we saying? I'm sorry. Oh, so yes, the difference is that when Christian and Matt Serafini and whoever else in Cyclopocalypse are going to get to do new novelizations, is they can, if they choose to, literally work from the finished film. They can, I mean, obviously I sent Christian the script to make it easier for him, and I'm sure that happened with the other ones as well. But they do have the advantage, well, the advantage or the disadvantage of the movie being finished. So you're right, in a way, it's less likely that you're going to get the scenes you didn't see, because the movie is a finished thing in a way that it wasn't for the writers of novelizations in the 80s. So, but in terms of my own experience, it was just pure pleasure. You know, I mean, I didn't want to interfere. The deal I made with Christian was, if you want to ask me anything or look at a different, you know, let me know, ask me stuff. So he's also really fast, by the way, like annoyingly fast, infuriatingly fucking fast. So it wasn't like I was hanging around for 9 weeks. I think he wrote that thing in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So he certainly asked a couple of questions and asked me to clarify a couple of points. But he just did it. He did not only a fine job, but a fast, fine job, which is why we hate him, Michael. We don't no. But yeah, no, he was quick and he was good.
That's great.
So yeah, so the experience was great. You know, it was a lot of fun. But I really feel like I can't. You know, my work on it was done in 1996. I mean, I was in touch with him, but I can't take any credit for the novelization. Other than it was based on my screenplay. But
that's great. So in 2012, Clive Barker, unfortunately, he had a health scare, right? He
sure.
was in a coma from toxic shock syndrome. You know, since then, he obviously has recovered, well, you know, to a degree. But you know, you guys are friends. So, I mean, what was that like for you? I mean, to have it such someone who you've known for so long go through something so arduous, and this creative force, you know,
Right.
kind of be in such a scary moment. I mean, you know, what was that like for you, kind of witnessing that and then seeing him, I assume, like kind of like fight to reclaim his life, if you will.
Sure.
And I mean, it was great that a few years back he finally got to go to conventions again. I got to meet him and all that, and it was great. But I mean, what was that like, experiencing that? Because I assume that you probably hadn't had many friends go through that before.
Right. Yeah. Like all of us, obviously I'll make this specifically about Clive in a moment, but I think like all of us, you know, when we're little kids, we don't lose that many people. I mean, even when you lose your grandparents, depending on what age you are, it's not a traumatized. Well, how can I speak for people? For some people, obviously, it's traumatizing to. What I mean is, we're sort of invulnerable as little kids. Death is something that happens, a long way away from the immediate circumstances of your life. And as we move into our teens, you get the occasional horrible shock. You know, a friend of mine was knocked down by a car and killed. You know, everybody has had experiences like that, but it's certainly not the norm for us. Certainly not with our peers. Grandparents' generation, eventually, sadly, parents' generation. You see that happen. And so, you know, maybe the people are I don't know whether people in the arts, I'd be interested in the statistics on this, because I did lose friends in our 30s and our 40s and our 50s. I'm not including you in the hour, obviously. In my generation's 30s, 40s, and 50s. And, you know, it's shocking when relatively young people either die or have a big health scare. And as you say, Clive was somebody I'd known since 1974. We weren't little kids together, but, you know, so it was, well, it was shocking. I mean, obviously, as ever, when that thing happens, your primary concern is simply for them. You know, it's like you want them to recover. You want them to recover completely. You want them to recover. You want them to recover quickly. And so, yeah, so that's what that was like. But undeniably, of course, there's also a sort of shock factor that hits you because it reminds you that we are no longer, in fact, 18 and 21, which was the age we were when we met. So, you know, there's a tiny little selfish fear that comes in. It's like, oh shit, is that the kind of thing that can happen to us now? Are we that old? And in a weird way, having lost friends and colleagues in my 30s, 40s, and 50s, possibly had, you know, laid protective pipe in a way for that to be less shocking than if that had been my first experience of it. But it was Clive, you know, so it was bad. And, you know, I can't begin to imagine what the recovery process was like for him and how, I mean, I know that it was tough, obviously. But in terms of like the as a third party, second, whatever, as not the subject, the hardest part was the period when we weren't sure if he was going to wake up, you know. Once he was recovering, when a person is in recovery, they are in recovery. So obviously there can be setbacks, obviously there can be terrible disappointments, and what looks like a recovery turns out not to be. But for the most part, once the recovery begins, it's like, you know, you're still very distressed, very concerned, very sympathetic, but you just assume, you know, little by little, day by day, you're getting better and better. So I think the worst part was this is such a petty and silly thing to say, but it'll make you laugh because it's just a human thing. My memory is that it was 7 days. Whatever period it was, that was what my point is. That was the worst time because it was like, is he going to come out of this? What I'm saying is funny is that I've heard Clive say in public 3 weeks, 2 months. And, you know, obviously he remembers whatever he remembers. And it was bad. But when you're old friends, you can laugh about shit that maybe other people wouldn't necessarily find funny. So a couple of times on phone calls, I've corrected him, which seems so petty and stupid about a guy's coma. It's like, you know, he's an imaginer, you know, that's his job. So he'll say something, oh yes, Peter, you know, and in the 2 months, and I'll say 7 days. Oh, fuck off. You know, but so, which, whenever somebody gets their sense of humor back, you know that they are actually recovering. So the fact that I can now occasionally give him shit about something as appalling as the duration of a coma is a good sign that he can laugh about that. But yeah, so
That's good. Well, I'm glad to hear he's doing better. I see he's actually going to be at the Outfest in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I didn't. I did the last time I spoke to him. As you get older, you have this will happen to you in the fullness of time, Michael. You'll realize, regardless, you know, nothing to do with Clive's health issues. It's just as you get older, you can go like 8 months without talking to a friend, and you haven't had a falling out or anything. You just well, we're not working on anything together, and we're old. We sit in our houses and watch TV, so it's not like I talk to him 3 times a week like we used to. But I don't know. I spoke to him 2 months ago, I think, and he didn't. He had been doing. But thank God, he'd got back to doing personal, as you say, he'd got back to doing personal appearances at conventions and things prior to the pandemic.
Right.
And then because of his health history, we all had to be careful, obviously. He had to be particularly careful during the pandemic. And I didn't realize that he was already scheduling appearances again, because he's doing Outfest, and again, he didn't tell me this one either, bastard. But oh God, isn't he doing a Days of the Dead or a? I thought I'd heard he was doing another Outfest. Obviously, he's probably making a special effort for because of his position and importance in the gay arts community. But I think he's doing a more traditional convention. Maybe edit this out if I'm full of crap, but I thought I saw that recently on Phil and Sarah's page or something. So I am delighted that he feels well enough and safe enough to be getting back out there.
Yeah, me too. So just to kind of wind down here, we've been talking about your writing for films and the great writers you've got to work with, but you've also written some novels of your own. Do you want to share some information about that and what the differences are between writing your own novel compared to your own script?
Sure. Well, more words, the average screenplay. I always like to start with the pragmatics because it's less embarrassing than talking about one's aims. And the pragmatics are that most screenplays are at 25,000-30,000 words, and the shortest novel is at least twice that. These days, you probably have trouble. The Great Gatsby is only 48,000 words, but most publishers would be very lucky if you sold a 48,000 word novel these days. But I'll take your question more seriously now. I apologize. It's strange. They are very different forms, and there are some superb novelists or superb prose fiction writers, let's say, rather than novel per se. Let's just say prose fiction. There are some superb prose fiction writers who just cannot write a decent screenplay to save their lives, and vice versa. There are some brilliant screenwriters who, and we know because some of them have tried and published novels, they're very different forms, and being good at one does not necessarily mean you will be good literally sometimes doesn't mean you'll be any good at the other, even if you're fantastic at one of them. But increasingly, over the last 4 or 5 generations, people are more comfortable. I mean, back in the 30s, you had, well, I just mentioned The Great Gatsby. You had people like Fitzgerald and Faulkner and a couple of other people from that generation of American literature trying to write screenplays, mostly with very limited success. And then, but in, well, I say our, I'm not sure of the breadth and range of your interests, but in our field, meaning fantasy, horror, science fiction, you soon had your Ray Bradburys and your Robert Blocks and your Bill Nolans and your George Clayton Johnsons and your Richard Mathesons, who were good at both, like very good in some cases at both. And I'm trying to name people. And then I guess a literary generation being about 10 years. You had the Bradbury, Block, Nolan, Beaumont generation. Then you would have the King, Straub, Ramsey Campbell generation. And certainly Stephen King has written screenplays and teleplays. But then I think it was our bunch, the sort of the guys born in the mid to late 50s, maybe because we grew up with more media in our youth than previous generations had, but I'm certainly not going to blow my own trumpet, but I seem to have been able to move comfortably between the two forms. And my contemporaries, R.C. Matheson, John Skipp and Craig Spector, Dave Scow. Now, again, you know, the names I don't mention are going to call me after they watch this and say, why did you? So I'll just stop there. All those people have certainly made a living in both fields. So I won't claim any of us. I won't claim any of us are any good. I'll just say we managed to make a living in both areas. But not everybody can jump from one to the other. And the big differences, I think, are, well, the obvious one that like any writing teacher would tell you, you don't really have what they call interiority, horrible word, neologism, interiority in movies. You can spend a lot of time inside a character's head in a novel. You can spend a lot of indulgent time inside a character's head in a novel, and you shouldn't. Let that be my advice to everybody out there. Keep it clean, keep it moving. And the trick of writing a screenplay is nothing to do with formatting or anything like that. It's to bear in mind always that your ultimate audience is not going to read your work. They are going to see and hear your work. So you must keep paramount in your mind, at the risk of looking like those idiots who wander around TV shows pretending to be directors. You have to look. Always, my shorthand for it when I talk to writing classes, screenwriting classes specifically, is pretend the movie's already been made and watch the movie in your head and write down what you see. Because if you tell them to do it that way, if you're abstract about it and try and tell people to, the great John Sayles wrote a book, which I think is called Thinking in Pictures, which is basically what I'm saying, think in pictures, not in abstract thoughts. But if you say something like think in pictures, that's a kind of loose instruction. And I find that if you tell somebody to just pretend you're watching the movie, that helps them think that visualization is a key factor in the writing of screenplays. I mean, I don't want to get in the weeds or too inside baseball about this, but I will say, just from personal experience, that whether you end up being good or bad at either of them, it is actually a very good exercise for any writer, he or she being interested in their own skill and craft, to mess about with the other form for a while, because they will teach you things about, let's assume for a second that you're only going to end up being good at one of them. You can nevertheless learn things that you perhaps otherwise wouldn't learn. For example, my experience, because I had written, as I say, I'd written short fiction before I wrote a screenplay. And there's no doubt that having written screenplays, my prose writing, well, I like to think, it got better. I can't say that, but I can say for sure that I was much more concerned with precision, clarity, and economy, because screenplays have to move. They don't have to be breakneck. They don't have to be stupid, but they've got to move. They have to hold attention. And so when I came back to prose, I don't know if I was any better, but I know I was more precise and clear. So, you know, that I'm babbling. I'm sorry.
That's good. And then just a couple things to wrap up. One, Hellraiser, the film rights have bopped around as we've talked about, and Clive, regained those rights. I think it was a year or two ago. Which it's kind of funny that now it's like kind of come home, if you will. And there's a movie coming out, I believe, on Halloween, and there's a TV adaptation for HBO. So what if Clive called you up and said, Pete, I'd like you to write a screenplay for Hellraiser? Would you say, sure, let's do it?
well, he's got my number. No, actually, let me take the question seriously. Well, I would be delighted to be asked. I don't know if, first of all, I don't think he would ask me to write a screenplay for Hellraiser, because to the best of my knowledge, that's in the can. The TV adaptation, I'm sure they will have several people writing episodes. So he could call me if he wanted. No. But the movie, I believe, is in the can already. David Bruckner directed it, and damn, I forgot, Luke Petrowski and his writing partner, the guys who wrote The Night House, which Bruckner directed, they wrote the Hellraiser Hulu movie. And then the other one, I mean, I hear the same mixed stories as you hear. I gather the other thing is for HBO Max, a possible series.
Yeah.
I don't know where that is in terms of its development, but the movie is done with Jamie Clayton as Pinhead. Clive had not seen a cut of the movie when I last spoke to him, but because we all want to know. So I did. I said, well, yeah, but how does Jamie look in the costume? How does she look as Pinhead? And he said, fantastic. So that's all I can tell you. That's all I know. But Clive thought Jamie Clayton looked fantastic. So that's all I can give you on the news front of it. I don't know if I listen. Teleplay and screenplay writing pay, unless you're John Grisham or Stephen King, pays a lot better than prose fiction. So if somebody were to offer me a gig at writing an episode, it would be hard to say no, because it would be nice. It would be nice to get a check for writing an episode. But in all seriousness, I don't know. My own fiction is not really in that world. Well, I mean, it never was in that world. But I've made jokes before that I've spent the last 2 decades disappointing my original fan base by writing quirky little ghost stories, because that's really what my fiction is, quirky and ghostly, rather than people being skinned alive. So I don't know. I think, other than the crass motivation of a check would be nice, I don't honestly think I would necessarily feel like doing it. I think it should probably be left to younger, fresher hands, because the odds are I would only sully my legacy. If what I leave them is Hellraiser 2, 3, and 4, obviously there are some mixed opinions about 3 and 4, but I could probably only come in and disappoint them again. So maybe not. But I'm a whore. So if the check's big enough and the offer is there, I would probably do it, but I probably shouldn't.
Oh, I meant to ask you, not to get into a huge discussion here about it, but so Hellraiser 4 actually was profitable. So why was that the last theatrical release? And what do you think of the sequels that followed, which were all like direct to video?
Well, I can answer that very directly, at least the first part. Second part's trickier. The first part I can answer very easily, because it was profitable. And in fact, briefly, before Bob Weinstein decided he hated us all, it had the strongest opening weekend of any Hellraiser picture. somewhere, I should get it out and frame it. Somewhere in my storage closet, I have the full page color ad from, again, you should explain to your young viewers, there used to be these things called the trade papers, the Hollywood Reporter and Variety. They were the newspapers of showbiz. And if your film company took out a full page ad thanking you, that was a big deal. And Bloodline opened with the best Hellraiser opening ever. And Miramax, I nearly said God bless them, but I'm just not going to let that phrase escape my mouth when it comes to Miramax. But Miramax took out a full page, full color ad in Variety and the Reporter, thanking by name me and Clive. And I assume Kevin, although the movie was an Alan Smithy credit by then. So maybe, oh God, maybe that's why I didn't frame it. Maybe they pointedly didn't include Kevin's name. I can't remember. Anyway, it was a very nice ego massage to see a full, you know, you call your mother about that. Ma, I got a full page ad in Variety. They thanked me. But that was the first weekend. Then word of mouth killed it. And yeah, it was profitable. They did not lose money on Hellraiser 4, but it was significantly less profitable than Hellraiser 3 had been, which we followed a normal pattern. Hellraiser 2 made almost as much money as the first Hellraiser, and Hellraiser 3 made almost as much money as Hellraiser 2. So there was a little drop off from 1 to 2 to 3. But then there was a big drop off. The numbers sound so small now because, you know, inflation in 30 years, I think it ended up making 16 million, which today, you know, like the biggest flop in the world makes 16 million. But for a movie that cost 3 or 4 million, that was fine. It just wasn't as fine as the 25 million or whatever that the other three had routinely made. None of them were big hits, by the way. The Nightmare movies, much more financially successful. Friday the 13th, much more financially successful. But yes, you're right. Bloodline was profitable, but not profitable enough for Miramax to feel it was an investment worth pursuing. So yeah, they went straight to direct-to-video, which meant they went non-union. So even if they had asked me back, which believe me, they were not about to do, they hated us by then just as much as we hated them. So they were not going to ask me anyway, but I couldn't have done it. I was not going to risk my guild membership by doing non-union work. And the second part of your question was, what do I think of the sequels? I'm glad to say I cannot venture an opinion, sir. I have not seen them. I wanted to watch, because Ashley came back and you know, Doug did all of them except for the last two. So I feel bad that that I didn't watch them for Doug's sake, but he got paid, you know. But then Ashley came back and did, you probably know better than I.
Yeah, Hellseeker.
Was that number 6 or number 7?
Yeah, I believe that was 6, because 5 actually had Craig Sheffer from Nightbreed.
I did go down on set to when Doug was out here shooting it. I went down to visit on that one, partly because I knew Craig was going to be there, so I got to say hello to him, who I hadn't seen for a few years. But I still didn't watch the movie, and I didn't. I meant to watch the one with Ashley, but I didn't. The only one I saw decades later, but you know, the way a lot of us see, you know, by accident late at night. And again, you will know this better than I. What's the video game one with Lance Henriksen?
Oh, Hellworld.
If you say so.
It was like the reality TV type of like.
Oh, is that what it is? Oh, I thought it was a video game. Yes, something like that.
It was video game related. It was pretty bad. That was not
Right.
not a favorite of mine.
Okay. Well, that's the only one I saw. I've certainly seen. Well, let me ask you this. I know that number 5, the first direct-to-video, although he didn't have a big name then, but it was directed by Scott Derrickson, who obviously has gone on to well, I assume bigger and better things. I haven't seen Inferno. Maybe it's his best movie. Maybe it's his first album. Maybe it's maybe it's his best work. But for viewers who might know, he's he did the first Doctor Strange movie. He's sort of A-list now, but I realize in retrospect that probably means Inferno, at least looks good, does it?
Yeah, Inferno to me is the best one. And you are right, by the way. Hellworld is based on a massive multiplayer online RPG. I was thinking of Halloween Resurrection with where that was the reality TV one with Busta Rhymes. That was terrible. But Hellworld was like the Halloween Resurrection for Hellraiser.
Right, right.
It was a best. But yeah, then they did the Revelations, which was literally I think it was Miramax or the Weinstein Company literally just trying not to lose the rights to Hellraiser.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. That the last 2 were made for that reason.
Yeah,
I think up to number 8, they shot 7 and 8 back to back, I think.
Yes,
and that was the last time Doug did it.
Right, and Revelations they filmed for $300,000, which is crazy. The Judgment was a step up. I think it was Paul Taylor who played.
Paul Taylor plays Pinhead, yeah.
And
Gary Tunnicliffe, who I mentioned earlier as an effects guy, he wrote and directed Judgment. So I want that to be good because it's in the family, so to speak. It's a guy. Ultimately, he traces lineage back to Image Animation. So
yeah.
So I'd like it to be good. But again, I know that was another $300,000 movie. So.
And the one Clive Barker directed movie we didn't talk about, so I just want to bring it up because in case you had some sort of connection to it. Did you have any connection to Lord of Illusions?
Only that we were shooting Bloodline while he was shooting Lord of Illusions, and neither of us were at one of the big studios. We were down on Venice. Well, not necessarily. We were in Venice, not Italy, folks. Venice, the neighborhood in LA, in converted factories that had become sound stages. Now, the Lord of Illusion shoot was in a fancier converted factory than the Bloodline shoot, but we were both in converted factories shooting. In my memory, where we were literally across the boulevard from each other. That's not true. We were several blocks away, but we could go and have lunch with various of us. Could go and have lunch with various of them, but other than that, no. Because Bloodline was happening and going badly. So other than wandering onto set to say hello to a couple of people, no, I knew nothing.
Yeah, I've always been a big Scott Bakula fan, and he's a really underappreciated actor and also a nice guy. And actually, one last Clive thing, and then I'm going to end with a final question for you. Sure. I actually really enjoyed the movie adaptation of Midnight Meat Train with Bradley Cooper.
Sure.
I thought it was good. And that was back when Bradley Cooper wasn't really a big name.
Right, he came out of Alias, right? He was what's her name? Jennifer Garner's platonic friend in the TV show Alias, I believe. I'm sure he'd made a couple of movies before Meat Train, but yeah, you're right. He was not yet Bradley Cooper.
Yeah, and then Clive obviously had a hand, and I think he was a producer for that as well. But sure. Yeah, it's just interesting to see all the different worlds he's lived in.
Right. And that one did okay, didn't it? I think.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
It did pretty well. I think it holds up still, and it's got that visceral quality to it. But yeah, having been a creative person in multiple fields, is there anything left that you haven't accomplished yet that you're like, I really want to do that, or any exciting projects on the horizon?
Yeah, well, I'm still working. So I have a new book, a collection of short stories coming out, hopefully by in time for Halloween. So I, you put me on the spot. No, I don't have any sort of massively unrealized ambition. Which is not to say that I feel in any sense I've accomplished anything. It was very odd to hear you say that phrase. But I, as they used to say in the 60s, I'm keeping on keeping on. So as I've said I'm an enormously lucky fellow because I've managed to get by. I ran away to join the circus, metaphorically, when I was 18, when I met Clive and Doug, basically. At that point, I was lost to the world of normality. I'd already been in a band, which is the one strand. That probably explains why I keep making analogies to first albums and shit. That would be my unrealized ambition.
You're going to start a band.
Yeah, well, I started several. I've been a working musician a lot, but never achieved any success. We had a little following in the pubs and clubs of Liverpool 40 years ago. But the point I'm making is that I'm very lucky. I've done theatre, I've done music, I've done movies, I've done books. I even got to write a couple of comic books as well. And I had lunch with Stan Lee. So what more could any little monster kid want when he grew up? But I did, I that's how I feel. I feel I made the choice to run away with the circus, and as did many of my friends and contemporaries, and some of them have achieved massive wealth and massive fame, and I have not. But I am very conscious of how lucky I am that I've just got to keep playing. I have managed to keep doing what I do, and so, but like I say, yes, in more pragmatic sense, I've got a book coming out in October, so that's the immediate priority, and hopefully also I've got this weird thing that happens now where when I was a younger writer and was lucky enough to, again, I'm lucky. I just know I'm lucky. When I got to befriend the great Ray Bradbury, I was a friend of Ray's for the last 10 years of his life. And I was also a friend of Bill Nolan, who was one of Ray's significantly older than me, proteges. But I remember them all, and the guy I mentioned earlier, Dennis Etchison, who was a very close personal friend for 30 years. And they all said to me at one stage or another, they said, one of them had got an award or something, and they were routinely using the word legend and I think it was George Clayton Johnson, who was one of the great Twilight Zone writers, and he said to me, legend, you just live long enough and every young shit will call you a legend. What they mean is they can't believe you're still alive. So it's like, and now I get asked to blurb books and say things and talk to people, and it's like, yeah, so I'm like an elder statesman, but it's just people's jaw drop when the guy that wrote Hellbound is alive. Jesus Christ, let's talk to him. So,
that's great. So for people who want to look out for your book, what's it going to be called?
It is going to be called All Our Hearts Are Ghosts and Other Stories. They're all all the stories in it have been published before, but they've not been collected. Again, I'm sure your viewers are familiar, but there are magazines that publish short fiction. There are books that are called anthologies, which collect together the work of different authors. So these are, how many's in there? 10 or 12 stories. The most recent ones I've written over the last 7 or 8 years. If they would care to visit my Amazon author page, I'm there as Peter Atkins. They can find my previous collection. They can find again, I'm lucky. Everything I did is still in print, or at least ebook form, either ebook or paperback. They can find novels and books there, should they so wish, but I'm not going to give them the hard sell.
Well, and you also have Doug Bradley narrating the audiobook.
Right. I should have mentioned. Yes.
What's
thank
that
you.
like?
Yeah. What was that like, did you say?
Yeah, having that voice.
Oh, well,
yeah. Bring your work to life.
Funny, like, I didn't really imagine he'd say no, but of course he could have, because it's not like it was HarperCollins doing an audiobook. It was Encyclopocalypse. It was the same small company. So I shouldn't make jokes. I was genuinely touched how immediately and quickly Doug said yes. I fired off a text and said, would you have any interest in? And he texted back immediately and said, absolutely. When do we do it? Which was great. So yes, if among your, I'm sure the broad canvas of your viewership, if there are hardcore Hellraiser fans in there, if they want to hear the actor who played Pinhead and spoke the lines that I wrote for Pinhead, if they want to hear that combination in a slightly different context, they can indeed obtain the audiobook of my novel Morning Star, read by the great Doug Bradley. Thank you for reminding me, Sarah. I would have forgotten.
No problem. All right. And if anyone wants to, aside from Amazon, any other places you'd like people to follow you?
Oh, yeah, I'm all about the social media these days, Michael, though I was a late adopter, but I'm on Facebook under my own name. Although I don't know how you find people on Facebook if there are other people, because the disambiguation thing, there's a very well-known chemistry professor / atheist, like a world famous atheist, a big zealot atheist called Peter Atkins, who's also a published author. Well, obviously he's an Oxbridge professor. Maybe he's not on Facebook, I don't know. But whatever tricks you use to find people on Facebook, I'm there under my own name. I'm much more easily findable on Twitter and Instagram, because there I am at LimeyBastard55. LIMEY bastard 55. So you can find me on Twitter and Insta, and indeed on Facebook. And thank you very much for asking. And anybody wants to pop over, more than welcome. Excellent.
Well, Peter, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I appreciate the lengthy discussion about your work, your thoughts on all these wonderful individuals you've had the opportunity to work with, and looking forward to picking up your book when it drops in October. Thank you, Michael. Thanks a lot. A really enjoyable conversation. Thank you. Thank you.